Jazz Music Since the 20th Century by Jeremy Terrazas. Why did I choose this topic? I chose to research jazz music because I enjoy its complex and improvisational tendencies. Most music follows a strict count and is mathematic in a way. Jazz music, however, blurs that line and allows the soloist to perform variations on the standard melody and play the instrument as an extension of their own voice with custom nuances throughout the improvisation. Where is this music located? Jazz music is unique to America and was developed in the early 20th century in urban areas of the United States such as New Orleans. The African American cultures of New Orleans, the mixed influence of ragtime, blues, and band music played at funerals brought about the emergence of jazz. After its birth in New Orleans, jazz moved west, east, and north up to Chicago by 1919. Its evolution was happening simultaneously in the 1920s in New Orleans, Chicago, and Kansas City. Jazz music was also heavily influenced by European music. It gets its blues, church choir vocals, beats, and improvisational influences from Africa, and the instruments such as the trumpet and piano and use of chords over leads from Europe. What are the general aesthetics and characteristics of jazz music? The term jazz, or jazz, derives from a Creole word that means both African dance and copulation. The first time the term jazz was used in reference to music was when it first appeared in a March 1913 edition of the San Francisco Bulletin. A major characteristic of jazz music is improvisational skills. Given argues good jazz improvisation is sociable and interactive, just like a conversation. Improvisation techniques such as motivic interaction are common in jazz music, where players will exchange identifiable figures, and the interactions can be either dialogic, when two or more musicians interact with one another, or monologic, where the first player does not reciprocate. Jazz developed out of Dixieland forms, and jazz styles ranged from hot jazz, like that played by Louis Armstrong, to symphonic jazz of Paul Whiteman. Hot jazz was one of the first influential developments of jazz music and featured a strong soloist who would pursue variations on the melody and served as the driving force for the expert ensemble of 5 to 7 players that accompanied him. Later in the 1920s, this idea of a soloist playing with a backup ensemble worked easily with larger bands that were beginning to form at the time. Who were some key musicians or composers? Near its birth in the first decade of the 20th century, jazz music was developed by musicians such as Buddy Bolden in New Orleans. As it started to pick up momentum in the country, it was spread by other New Orleans jazz groups and performers such as King Oliver and his Creole Jazz Band and Jelly Roll Morton. Shortly after King Oliver's band gained popularity, they were joined by young Louis Armstrong, who was the eventual pioneer of the rapid rhythmic style of jazz known as hot jazz. Jazz became a national American phenomenon after Bix Beiderbecke, Jack Teagarden, and Joe Venuti all began to copy the New Orleans style of jazz bands, making it appealing to sophisticates and young audiences around the country. Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington brought together African American orchestras that began performances at prominent nightclubs in Chicago and New York. Female vocalists also had a large part in the evolution of jazz, such as Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan. How has this music genre changed over time? When jazz was first introduced, it enjoyed most of its popularity in nightclubs as music to dance to. As time progressed, jazz music found itself becoming more esoteric and sophisticated than popular. Although it was able to continue influencing future genres of music such as rock and roll, the audience for jazz was in decline and was no longer having any direct effect of the evolution of popular music at the time. Jazz was able to retain its ties to nightclubs, but had lost its carefree atmosphere it was once associated with. During the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, jazz musicians became associated with the innovations of counterculture sentiment. Throughout this time period, jazz musicians also became associated with civil rights efforts such as black nationalism and other popular movements of the period. In the 1970s, drug use was common among jazz musicians who had long been linked to urban lifestyles, as drug use in general was a popular choice for those seeking to openly rebel and be a part of the hippie and youth movements of the 1970s. Is this music genre popular? At the height of its popularity, jazz music was an American national phenomenon, appealing to sophisticated people and young audiences alike. It enjoyed mass and rapid popularity growth because of its connection to dancing and nightlife. Jazz bands making live appearances, the booming recording industry of the time, and prohibition were all major factors in the popularity growth of jazz at the time. Who are its audiences? Jazz music first originated in New Orleans, the first audiences being young, primarily African American urban people attending nightclubs. However, after its birth, it has enjoyed popularity amongst varying ethnic and age groups of people, including sophisticated adults, young audiences, Europeans, and Americans. Does this music genre have an international community? The association with nightclubs and nightlife that jazz music enjoys is what makes it become both attractive and exotic to international communities such as Europe. During the Cold War, the United States profited immensely from the sale of commercial jazz music abroad because of its popularity outside of the United States and because of the popularity of swing, a jazz-inflected dance music that was developed in the 1930s but became hugely popular during World War II. During the 1950s and 60s, many communities in Africa also embraced American popular culture, including jazz music. What is the future for this genre? In the later part of the 20th century, jazz continued to develop into multiple styles such as free jazz, soul jazz, and jazz rock fusion. These were attempts made to reclaim jazz music as a specifically African American musical tradition, regardless of it being an integrated effort. As time progressed, jazz ensembles became smaller and their music became more experimental and esoteric, aimed at appreciative listeners rather than dancing. Jazz clubs have developed in large cities, but its popularity not ever reaching the level it was during the jazz swing era. Today, jazz music is growing to become increasingly popular internationally and is enjoying more participation by women jazz musicians. It will continue to influence future genres of music and the development of varying musical styles. The future of jazz is unclear, as public opinion on music as a whole has shifted drastically away from the complexities and esoteric style of jazz music, favoring instead more simplistic beat-driven synthesized versions.